The tourney at Harrenhal should have been a celebration. That's what everyone said when the ravens flew out across the 7 kingdoms, carrying invitations sealed with the twin-headed dragon of House Went. The greatest tourney in living memory, they promised. Gold and glory for the winners. A spectacle to rival the old days, when dragons still flew and Targaryens ruled unchallenged. But nothing in the year 281 after Aegon's conquest was quite what it seemed. Lord Walter Went claimed he was celebrating his daughter's name day. A generous father, people said, though whispers followed close behind those words. How does a minor house like the Wents afford such extravagance? The prize purse alone would bankrupt most lords. 40,000 golden dragons for the champion of the joust, 20,000 for the runner-up, fortunes for the melee and archery contests besides. Went was rich, certainly, but not that rich. Some muttered that he had a patron. Others wondered if this tourney served purposes beyond celebration and sport. But Lord Went smiled and made his preparations, and the ravens kept flying. They flew to Storm's End, where young Robert Baratheon ruled with all the confidence of a man who had never known defeat. They flew to Winterfell, where Lord Rickard Stark brooded over his plans for southern alliances. They flew to the Eyrie, where Jon Arryn watched the realm with an old man's wisdom and growing worry. They flew to Casterly Rock, where Tywin Lannister sat in cold anger, his son stolen away to wear a white cloak. They flew to Dragonstone, where Prince Rhaegar Targaryen read ancient prophecies by candlelight. And in King's Landing, King Aerys II of House Targaryen received his invitation with eyes that burned too bright. The Mad King, they called him, though never to his face. Not yet. Not openly. But the whispers were there, growing louder with each passing moon. Aerys had not left the Red Keep in years. He feared assassins in every shadow, poison in every cup, treachery in every smile. His fingernails had grown long and yellow, curling like talons. His hair hung matted and unwashed, shot through with silver and grey. The Queen rarely came to his chambers any more. The small council walked on eggshells around him, but a tourney, a gathering of lords, a chance to see if his enemies would dare show their faces before their king. Aerys announced he would attend Harrenhal himself. The news sent ripples of shock through the Red Keep. Lord Varys, the master of whisperers, smiled his spider's smile and murmured soothing words. Sir Jaime Lannister, the youngest knight of the Kingsguard, felt his stomach turn to stone. Grand Maester Pycelle stroked his beard and wondered if this was wisdom or madness. In truth, it was both. Or neither. Aerys no longer saw the difference. The king feared his son more than he feared anyone else. Rhaegar was everything Aerys was not. Loved by the people, admired by the lords, strong, handsome, capable, dangerous. The rumours said that lords were gathering to Rhaegar's banner, that they planned to set aside the mad father for the golden son. Aerys heard these whispers from Varys, twisted them in his mind until they became certainties, and decided he would go to Harrenhal to show the realm who was king. Sir Jaime would go with him, of course. The boy with golden hair and a white cloak, Tywin Lannister's pride made into the king's hostage. Aerys took particular pleasure in that. The great Tywin, humbled, his heir denied to him. Every time Jaime stood behind the Iron Throne in his white armour, Aerys knew his former hand was grinding his teeth in rage at Casterly Rock. But that was the Mad King's way now. He measured his power in the pain of others. Spring came early to the Riverlands that year. They called it the Year of the False Spring, though no one knew it yet. The snows melted early. Green grass pushed up through the mud. Flowers bloomed weeks ahead of their time. The small folk whispered that it was a sign, an omen, a blessing from the gods. They were wrong, of course, but they wouldn't learn that until the spring died and the cold came back, harsher than before. Harrenhal rose massive and dark beside the God's Eye, its 5 great towers reaching up like burned fingers clawing at the sky. The castle was a ruin and a monument at once. Harren the Black had built it to last forever, and then Aegon the Conqueror had come with his dragons and turned stone to liquid, melting the towers from within. 300 years later, the scars still remained. No amount of repair could erase what Dragonfire had done. But the courtyards were large enough for a tourney. The great hall could seat thousands. And Lord Went had spent a fortune preparing for his guests. They came in their hundreds. Lords and ladies, knights and squires, merchants and hedge knights and camp followers. The roads around Harrenhal filled with travellers. Pavilions sprouted like mushrooms in the fields. Banners snapped in the spring wind, displaying every sigil in the 7 kingdoms. The direwolf of Stark, the crowned stag of Baratheon, the lion of Lannister, the falcon of Arryn, the sun and spear of Martell, the rose of Tyrell, the kraken of Greyjoy. And above them all, the 3-headed dragon of House Targaryen. Aerys arrived with a column of guards in red cloaks and gold. The Kingsguard rode beside his wheelhouse, 7 knights in white enamel armour that shone like ice in the sunlight. At their head rode Lord Commander Gerald Hightane, the White Bull, ancient and proud. Beside him rode Prince Luin Martell and Sir Barristan Selmy, the best sword in the 7 kingdoms. Behind them came Sir Jonathan Darry, Sir Oswell Went, and Sir Arthur Dane, the Sword of the Morning, whose great sword Dawn caught the light like a falling star. And at the end rode Sir Jaime Lannister, barely 17, beautiful and bitter in equal measure. Jaime had joined the Kingsguard less than a year ago. It had seemed like glory then. The youngest knight ever to wear the white cloak. His father had been furious, which made it even sweeter at the time. But Jaime was learning the difference between glory and honour. Glory was what people saw from the outside. Honour was what you felt when you closed your eyes at night. He felt very little honour these days. The crowds parted for the king. Lord Went knelt in the mud. His family knelt beside him. Aerys barely looked at them as he passed. His eyes scanned the crowds like a man searching for knives in the dark. His guards surrounded him in a wall of steel. He did not smile. He did not wave. He was here to watch his enemies, and his enemies were everywhere. Prince Rhaegar arrived separately, riding a black stallion with his personal guard around him. He wore dark armour chased with rubies, his long silver gold hair hanging past his shoulders. Women sighed when they saw him. Men whispered and wondered. The prince had a sadness about him, a melancholy that never quite left his eyes. Some said he read too much. Others said he thought too much. His wife, Princess Elia of Dorne, travelled with him, pale and frail, their daughter Rhaenys in her arms, and their son Aegon still a babe in swaddling clothes. The prince and the king barely spoke when they met. Lord Rickard Stark came with his sons and his daughter. Brandon was the eldest, tall and handsome, every inch the young lord. He rode like he owned the world, and in his mind, perhaps he did. His brother Eddard was quieter, more serious, fostered at the Eyrie with Jon Arryn and Robert Baratheon. And then there was Lyanna, grey-eyed and wild, with her father's long face and a spirit that would not be tamed. She was promised to Robert Baratheon, a match that would bind the stag and the wolf. Lord Rickard was pleased with the arrangement. Brandon approved of it. Even Eddard, Robert's closest friend, thought it a fine thing. But no one had asked Lyanna what she thought. Robert arrived in a storm of noise and laughter. Lord of Storm's End at barely 20, tall and powerful, with thick black hair and eyes like blue fire. He had the strength of a giant and the appetite of 10 men. He drank, he laughed, he fought. He took women to his bed and forgot their names by morning. Some said he was the finest young lord in the 7 kingdoms. Others said he would burn himself out before he reached 30. Both were right. Robert saw Lyanna across the tourney grounds and smiled. She was his betrothed, his future wife, the girl who would give him sons to carry on his line. He thought he loved her, in his way. He thought she was a prize worth winning. But Robert Baratheon had never learned the difference between wanting something and understanding it. Lyanna saw him watching and looked away. The other lords came in their own time, with their own purposes. Lord Jon Arryn, old and wise, who had fostered Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon as his wards. Lord Hoster Tully, trying to arrange marriages for his daughters. Lord Tyrell of Highgarden, bringing the wealth and power of the Reach. Even Lord Quellan Greyjoy came from the Iron Islands, a rare thing, for the Ironborn had little love for Greenlander games. And everywhere, moving through the crowds like smoke, was Lord Varys. The Spider, they called him, the Master of Whisperers, a eunuch from across the sea who somehow knew everything that happened in the 7 kingdoms before it happened. He wore soft slippers that made no sound on stone. He smiled and bowed and murmured pleasantries. His eyes missed nothing. Varys served the king because the king paid him. But Varys served himself first, and everyone knew it. He collected secrets the way a maester collected books. Information was power, and Varys was perhaps the most powerful man at Harrenhal, though he would never pick up a sword or wear a suit of armour. He watched the lords gathering and smiled to himself. They all had their plans, their ambitions, their schemes. Some wanted to replace Aerys with Rhaegar. Some wanted to strengthen their own positions. Some simply wanted to survive whatever storm was coming, because a storm was coming. Even those who didn't know it felt it in their bones. The tourney grounds filled with noise and colour. Smiths hammered on anvils, repairing armour and sharpening swords. Merchants sold their wares from stalls and wagons. Musicians played. Dogs barked. Children ran between the pavilions, drunk on excitement. The smell of roasting meat drifted across the fields, mixing with the scents of horses and leather and sweat. At night, the camps lit up with 1,000 campfires. Lords drank wine in their pavilions and made their plans. Knights boasted of their prowess and wagered on tomorrow's jousts. Squires cleaned armour and tended horses. And high in the towers of Harrenhal, King Aerys stared out at the fires and saw enemies gathering to destroy him. He was not entirely wrong. The tourney at Harrenhal was many things. It was sport and spectacle. It was politics and pageantry. It was a gathering of the great houses, a chance to make alliances and settle grudges and show the realm who mattered. But beneath it all, like a current running deep and dark, was something else. A feeling, a sense that the world was balanced on a knife's edge, ready to tip one way or another. The Mad King on his throne, seeing traitors in every shadow, The prince with his prophecies and his melancholy, the lords with their secret plans, the young ones, like Robert and Brandon and Jaime, still too young to understand what they were caught up in. No one at Harrenhal knew they were living through the last great gathering before the realm tore itself apart. They thought they were attending a tourney. They thought they would see some jousts, drink some wine, go home to their castles, and continue their lives as before. They were wrong, because at Harrenhal, in the year of the false spring, everything was about to change. A prince would make a choice that would haunt him to his grave. A king would see his fears confirmed. A girl would receive a crown she never wanted, and the 7 kingdoms would begin their long slide toward war. But first, there would be a tournament. The knights prepared their armor. The horses were fed and groomed. The small folk pressed against the briars, eager to see their heroes. Lord Went stood in his place of honor, pleased with what he had created. The banners snapped in the wind. The sun shone down on the fields beside the God's Eye. And somewhere in the shadows, Varys watched it all and made his calculations, wondering which of these proud lords and knights would still be alive when this was over. The tourney at Harrenhal was beginning, and with it, the beginning of the end. The morning of the first day dawned clear and bright. The false spring had settled over the riverlands like a blessing, warm winds carrying the scent of new grass and early flowers. The crowds gathered early, filling the stands and pressing against the wooden barriers that lined the lists. Small folk and merchants, minor knights and landed lords, all came to see the spectacle. Some had travelled for weeks to be here. They would not miss a moment. The tourney field stretched long and wide, the lists running down the centre like a scar. At either end stood pavilions draped in silk and banners, places where the knights could rest between tilts. The stands rose high on both sides, timber structures built just for this occasion. Lord Went had spared no expense. The wood was fresh cut and strong. The seats were cushioned for the noble guests. Wine and food would flow freely throughout the day. At the place of highest honour sat King Aerys II. He looked like a corpse draped in cloth of gold. His robes hung loose on his frame, for he had grown thin over the years, eating little, trusting less. His hair fell past his shoulders in matted tangles of silver and grey. His fingernails had grown long and twisted, yellow as old bone. But his eyes were the worst. They burned with a fever that never cooled, darting from face to face, searching for the knives he knew were coming. Beside him sat Queen Rhaegar, beautiful and sad, her hands folded in her lap. She'd learned long ago not to speak unless spoken to. The bruises from their last argument had faded, but the memory remained. She wore long sleeves, despite the warmth of the day. The Kingsguard stood behind the royal seats, white cloaks hanging still in the morning air. 7 knights sworn to protect the king with their lives, 7 of the finest warriors in the 7 kingdoms. And every one of them knew that the man they protected had gone mad. Sir Jaime Lannister stood at the end of the line, as befitted the youngest. His armour was spotless white, polished until it shone like a mirror. His golden hair caught the sunlight. Women in the stands pointed and whispered. He was beautiful, they said, a knight from a song. Jaime heard them and felt nothing but contempt. For them, for himself, for the white cloak that had seemed like such an honour a year ago and now felt like a chain. He had joined the Kingsguard to prove himself, to show his father that he was more than just an heir, more than just a piece on Tywin Lannister's game board. King Aerys had accepted him gladly, knowing it would wound Tywin to lose his son and heir, and it had worked. His father's rage had been legendary. His sister Cersei had wept and called him a fool. Perhaps she was right, because now Jaime stood guard over a madman, sworn to protect a king who grew more unstable with every passing day. He had thought the Kingsguard meant glory. He had thought it meant standing beside heroes like Sir Arthur Dane and Sir Barristan Selmy. He had not understood that it also meant watching your king burn men alive and doing nothing because your oath forbade it. The white cloak was very heavy these days. Across the field, in a pavilion of black and red, Prince Rhaegar Targaryen prepared for the day. He would not joust in the early rounds. Princes rarely did. But he would be there, watching, his presence reminder of what the Targaryen name had once meant, before his father had dragged it through mud and madness. Rhaegar was 24, in the prime of his life, tall and lean, with the silver gold hair and purple eyes of old Valyria. He was a skilled warrior, a finer knight than many gave him credit for. But he had never wanted to be a warrior. As a boy, he had loved books and songs, music and prophecy. Only later, after reading something in a dusty scroll, had he announced that he must be a warrior, that it was required of him. No one knew what he had read. Rhaegar never said. His wife, Princess Elia, sat in the stands with their children. She was beautiful in her way, dark-haired and delicate, with the olive skin of dawn. But childbirth had weakened her. The maesters said she would likely bear no more children. Rhaegar needed 3, he said. The dragon has 3 heads. Another piece of prophecy that no one else understood. Elia watched her husband with knowing eyes. She loved him, perhaps. Or perhaps she had simply learned to accept what her marriage was. A political arrangement, a duty, nothing more, nothing less. In another section of the stands, Lord Rickard Stark sat with his children. The Lord of Winterfell was a tall man, stern and grey, with the long face that marked all the Starks. He had come south with purposes beyond watching jousts. He wanted alliances. He wanted his house bound to the great powers of the south. His son Brandon would marry Catelyn Tully. His daughter Lyanna would marry Robert Baratheon. His second son, Eddard, was already a brother to Robert in all but blood, fostered together at the Eyrie under Jon Arryn's care. The Stark in Winterfell, alone in the north, answering to no one. That was the old way. But Rickard Stark had new ideas. He wanted his house to matter in the south. He wanted a voice in the games that decided the fate of kingdoms. Some called it ambition. Others called it the Southron ambitions, whispered in dark corners where the king's spies might not hear. A network of alliances between the great houses, all carefully arranged through marriage and fosterage. Stark, Baratheon, Arryn, Tully, perhaps even Lannister, before Aerys stole Jaime away. If such a conspiracy existed, no one spoke of it openly. But the marriages were real, the bonds were real, and King Aerys watched from his seat of honour with eyes that saw traitors in every friendly smile. Brandon Stark stood at the rail, watching the knights prepare. He was a man grown at 20, strong and handsome, with his father's long face and his own easy confidence. He wore his arrogance like a cloak, but he had the skill to back it up. He was a fine swordsman, a better rider, and he feared nothing in this world. Some said he was too bold, too quick to anger, too certain of his own righteousness. They were right, but Brandon would never admit it. His brother Eddard sat beside him, quieter, more thoughtful. Ned had the Stark look as well, but where Brandon burned hot, Ned ran causal. He measured his words before speaking. He thought before acting. Lord Arryn had raised him well. Robert Baratheon loved Ned like a brother, and Ned returned that love, though he sometimes wondered if Robert would ever grow up. And then there was Lyanna. She sat with the other noble ladies, wearing a dress of grey silk that matched her eyes. Her dark hair was braided in the northern fashion. She looked every inch a lady, proper and refined. But anyone who knew her knew that Lyanna Stark hated sitting still. She wanted to ride, to fight, to run wild like the wolves her house was named for. Instead, she sat in the stands and smiled politely, while people talked about her upcoming marriage to Robert Baratheon. She had met Robert only once, briefly, at a feast. He had been loud and drunk and handsome, laughing with his friends, barely noticing her, except to say she was pretty. She heard the stories about him, the women he bedded, the wine he drank, the fights he started. Her brother Ned assured her that Robert was a good man, a true friend, someone who would treat her well. Lyanna was not convinced. She watched Robert now, across the field, surrounded by his friends from the Stormlands. He was impossible to miss. Tall as a giant, broad in the shoulders, with thick black hair and a beard that made him look older than his 20 years. He laughed at something one of his companions said, a booming sound that carried across the Tourney grounds. He had not looked at her once this morning. Robert Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End, was exactly where he wanted to be, surrounded by friends, with wine in his belly and a tourney to watch, a warhammer strapped to his saddle in case anyone challenged him. He had already decided he would enter the melee. The joust was fine for pretty boys who liked prancing around on horses, but Robert preferred his fights direct and brutal. Put him in the melee with a hammer in his hands, and he would show these southern knights what a Stormlander could do. He was betrothed to Lyanna Stark, the wolf girl from the north. He'd seen her a few times now. She was beautiful, or would be when she grew into herself. Wild, they said, spirited. That was good. Robert liked spirit in his women. He thought they would be happy together. He thought she would give him strong sons and not complain too much when he took his pleasures elsewhere. It never occurred to him to ask what she wanted. Near Robert sat Jon Arryn, Lord of the Eyrie, as close to a father as Robert had ever known. Jon was old now, his hair white, his face lined with years of responsibility. He had fostered Robert and Ned Stark both, raising them as his own, teaching them honour and duty and the ways of lordship. He loved them as sons, though Robert sometimes made him wonder if the lesson on restraint had ever taken hold. Jon Arryn watched the gathering with careful eyes. He saw the alliances forming. He saw the tensions simmering beneath the surface. He saw King Aerys sitting in judgment over his lords, paranoid and dangerous. And he wondered, not for the first time, if the realm could survive much longer with such a king on the Iron Throne. But open rebellion, that was treason. That was unthinkable. Jon Arryn had fought in wars before. He knew what they cost. He would do almost anything to prevent another. Almost anything. In a pavilion of crimson and gold, far from the royal box, Lord Tywin Lannister was notably absent. The Warden of the West had not come to Harrenhal. Some said it was pride, others said it was anger. His son wore a white cloak now, stolen away by a mad king's spite. His daughter had been rejected as a bride for Prince Rhaegar, another insult Tywin would not forget. The richest man in the Seven Kingdoms sat in Casterly Rock and brooded on his grievances. But his brother was here. Sir Kevan Lannister, solid and dependable, represented House Lannister in Tywin's absence. And through the crowds moved other Lannisters and Lannister cousins, keeping their eyes open, making note of who spoke to whom, gathering information to send back west. The Lannisters never forgot a slight, and they always paid their debts. Near the field, hedge knights and minor lords gathered in their own pavilions, hoping for a chance at glory. Most would be eliminated in the first day. The truly skilled knights, the champions, would sweep them aside like chaff. But hope lived eternal in every young man's heart. Perhaps today would be the day they unseated a great lord. Perhaps today would be the day their name was remembered. For most, it would not. Lord Went moved through the crowds, playing the gracious host, ensuring everyone had wine and food and comfortable seats. His castle loomed behind him, dark and massive. The wealth required to host this tourney still puzzled many. Where had the gold come from? Some whispered that Prince Rhaegar himself had provided it, that this tourney was meant to be something more than sport, a gathering where lords could meet away from the king's immediate presence, a place where plans could be made. Others dismissed such talk as foolish rumour. Lord Went was simply a generous man celebrating his daughter. Nothing more. But Varys heard the whispers. He always did. The master of whisperers moved through the crowds like a ghost, his soft slippers making no sound, his hands tucked into his sleeves. He smiled and bowed to lords and ladies. He murmured compliments and pleasantries. And all the while his eyes watched everything, his mind filing away every gesture, every glance, every word spoken in supposed privacy. Varys served the realm he claimed. But the realm was an abstract thing. Kings rose and fell. Dynasties ended. The small folk suffered regardless. Varys gathered his secrets, made his plans, and if anyone truly knew what the spider wanted, they were wise enough to keep that knowledge to themselves. The sun climbed higher. The crowds grew restless with anticipation. Knights mounted their horses and took up their lances. Squires checked armour one last time. Lords placed their wagers. Ladies tied their favours to lances and belts, hoping their chosen knights would bring them glory. The herald stepped forward, a man with a voice like thunder, and called for silence. The tourney at Harrenhal was about to begin. And every person there, from the Mad King in his seat of honour to the lowest hedge knight preparing for his first tilt, was about to become part of something larger than themselves. They did not know it yet. They did not know that this gathering would be remembered for centuries, that songs would be written about what happened here, that the realm itself would be forever changed by the choices made in the days to come. They only knew that the sun was shining, the banners were flying, and the first two knights were raiding toward the lists. The crowd roared its approval. The tourney had begun, and in the shadows of Harrenhal, where the old stones still bore the scars of dragonfire, something ancient and inevitable began to stir. Not magic, not prophecy, just the simple, terrible weight of human choice and consequence, gathering momentum like a boulder rolling down a hill. No one could stop it now, not even if they wanted to. The first lance shattered with a crack like thunder. The crowd roared as splinters flew through the air, glittering in the sunlight like falling snow. The knight on the left swayed in his saddle, but held his seat. His opponent had struck true, but not true enough. They wheeled their horses and returned to opposite ends of the lists, squires rushing forward with fresh lances. This was what they had come to see: steel and courage, skill and strength, the ancient test of knighthood played out in the spring sunshine before thousands of watching eyes. The tourney at Harrenhal would last for days, perhaps a week or more. There were dozens of knights entered in the joust alone, and each match required multiple passes. The melee would come later, a savage free-for-all where men fought with blunted swords until only one remained standing. There would be archery contests and axe-throwing, horse races and tests of strength. Singers would compete for prizes. Fools would juggle and jest. But the joust was the heart of it all, the true measure of a knight. The herald's voice boomed across the field, announcing each contestant. Minor knights and hedge knights filled the early brackets, men with worn armour and tired horses hoping for one moment of glory before being swept aside by their betters. The crowd cheered for them anyway. Everyone loved an underdog, even when they knew the underdog had no chance. A knight from the Reach unhorsed a Riverlander in the second tilt. A Stormlander lasted 4 passes against a man from the Westerlands before his shield split and he yielded. One after another, the matches played out, quick and brutal, settling into a rhythm that the crowd swayed to like a pulse. King Aerys watched with eyes that never blinked. He sat forward in his seat, gripping the armrests with his yellowed talons, drinking in every moment of violence. When a knight fell hard, armour clanging on packed earth, the king laughed, a high, sharp sound that made the people nearest him flinch. Queen Rhaegar did not watch the field. She watched her hands, folded in her lap, and said nothing. Behind them, Sir Jaime Lannister stood at attention, white cloak hanging motionless down his back. He had positioned himself where he could see both the king and the field. It was what a good Kingsguard did. Watch everything, miss nothing. Be ready to throw yourself between the king and any threat, no matter how small. But Jaime's mind wandered, despite his training. He watched the knights tilting at each other, and remembered when he had done the same. Before the white cloak, he had been good at it, very good. He had unhorsed men twice his age, men who should have beaten him easily. The rush of the charge, the impact of lance on shield, the roar of the crowd when you struck true. He missed it more than he cared to admit. Now he stood and watched others compete, while he guarded a madman who saw enemies in the air itself. The morning wore on. The sun climbed higher, warming the field, making the knights sweat beneath their armour. Squires ran back and forth with water and wine. Horses were changed out when they tired. The smell of dust and horse and sweat filled the air, mixing with roasting meat from the food stalls and the sour tang of spilled beer. In the stands, Brandon Stark leaned forward, elbows on the rail, watching every pass with the eye of a man who understood warfare. He had not entered the joust himself. His father had forbidden it. "You are my heir," Lord Rickard had said. "You do not risk yourself in games." Brandon had argued, of course, but in the end he obeyed. The Wolf of Winterfell did not disobey his father, but it galled him to sit and watch while others fought for glory. Beside him, Eddard Stark watched with quieter interest. Ned had never loved Tourneys the way some men did. He could fight, certainly. Lord Arryn had trained him well, but he saw no honour in unhorsing a man who had done you no wrong, no glory in winning a game. Still, he understood why others loved it. The pageantry, the excitement, the chance to prove yourself before the realm. Robert Baratheon certainly loved it. Ned could hear his friend's voice carrying across the stands, shouting encouragement to the Stormlanders, laughing when someone took a hard fall, already half drunk, though it was barely past midday. Robert lived for moments like this. War and wine and women. He was happiest when he was fighting or feasting, and he saw no reason to choose between them. Lyanna Stark sat with the other ladies and tried not to show her boredom. The joust was exciting for the first few matches. After that, it became repetitive. One knight charged another. Lances broke. Someone fell. The crowd cheered. Then it happened again, and again, and again. She would rather be riding, or practicing with a sword, though her father would be furious if he knew she did such things. Ladies were supposed to sit and watch and look pretty, and tie their favours to knights' lances. They were not supposed to wish they could be the ones charging down the lists with a lance in their hand. A roar from the crowd pulled her attention back to the field. A hedge knight had just unhorsed a lordling from the Crownlands, and the crowd loved it. The common people always cheered loudest when a nobody beat a somebody. It gave them hope, perhaps, a reminder that birth and wealth did not guarantee victory. The hedge knight raised his fist to the crowd, drinking in their approval. Tomorrow he would likely be eliminated by a better opponent, but today was his. Let him enjoy it. The matches continued through the morning and into the afternoon. The field of competitors slowly narrowed as the weaker knights were eliminated. The true champions began to emerge. Sir Barristan Selmy, the finest sword in the Seven Kingdoms, unhorsed 3 opponents in succession, barely seeming to try. The crowd chanted his name, Barristan the Bold, a living legend. Sir Arthur Dane, the Sword of the Morning, rode with the pale blade, Dawn strapped to his back, more symbol than weapon in a joust. But he needed no special blade to win. His skill with a lance was nearly as legendary as his skill with a sword. He shattered lances with surgical precision, striking exactly where he intended every single time. Other great knights showed their prowess as well. Sir Oswell Went, fighting before his home castle. Prince Lewin Martell of the Kingsguard. Sir Gerald Hightower, the White Bull, old but still formidable. And younger men too, knights hungry to make their names. Each victory brought them closer to glory and gold. But the crowds were waiting for one knight in particular. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen had not yet entered the lists. He sat in his pavilion, speaking with his supporters, watching the earlier rounds with eyes that seemed to see something beyond the field. His armour waited on its stand, black plate chased with rubies that glowed like frozen drops of blood. His shield bore the 3-headed dragon of House Targaryen. His lance rested against the pavilion wall, ready. When he finally emerged, the crowd fell silent for a heartbeat, then erupted into cheers. Rhaegar mounted his black stallion with easy grace. He settled his shield and took his lance from a squire. He wore no favour on his arm, no lady's token. Princess Elia watched from the stands with an expression that revealed nothing. The prince nodded to the herald and took his place at the end of the lists. His opponent was a knight from the Stormlands, a big man on a bigger horse, with a reputation for brutal charges. The crowd expected this to be quick. A prince of the blood against a mere knight. The outcome seemed certain. The marshal dropped his flag. Both horses exploded forward. The thunder of hooves shook the ground. Rhaegar leaned into his charge, lance steady, every movement controlled and precise. His opponent charged like a wild bull, all power and fury. They met in the centre with a crash that made the stands tremble. The Stormlander flew backward out of his saddle, as if struck by a giant's fist. He hit the ground hard enough to bounce, his armour ringing like a bell. His horse galloped on without him. The lance in Rhaegar's hand had shattered completely, splinters scattered across 20 feet of field. The crowd went wild. Rhaegar circled his horse and returned to his end of the lists, already dismounting dispersed to the food stalls and alehouses, already arguing about what they had seen, making wagers on tomorrow's matches. In the royal box, King Aerys rose and departed, surrounded by his Kingsguard, still muttering about conspiracies and hidden enemies. The Knight of the Laughing Tree had unsettled him in ways the other matches had not. A mystery, a hidden face. It fed every paranoid thought in his twisted mind. Prince Rhaegar watched his father leave, then turned his gaze back to the field. The sun caught the rubies in his armour, making them glow like drops of fire. He stood there for a long moment, silent and still, before finally turning away. Tomorrow the tourney would continue. More matches, more victories and defeats. And somewhere in the camp, a mystery knight hid from the king's searchers, and the truth remained buried beneath steel and silence. The first day of the great tourney at Harrenhal was done, and already the cracks were beginning to show. Small things, tensions, questions, nothing that seemed important yet. But in a realm balanced on a knife's edge, small things had a way of becoming large very quickly. Night fell over Harrenhal like a dark cloak, and the castle transformed. The tourney grounds grew quiet, the lists empty and ghostly in the moonlight. But the camps came alive, with fire and noise. 1,000 campfires burned in the fields around the god's eye, turning the night into a constellation of orange stars. The smell of roasting meat and wood smoke drifted across the water. Laughter and singing echoed from pavilion to pavilion. But not all the conversations were loud. Not all the meetings were public. In a pavilion far from the king's ears, Lord Rickard Stark sat with Jon Arryn and Hoster Tully. 3 great lords, sharing wine in the darkness, speaking in voices too low for guards to overhear. No servants attended them. No squires stood watch inside. This was a conversation that required privacy. They talked of marriages first. Safe talk, public talk. Brandon Stark would wed Catelyn Tully, binding the north to the Riverlands. Lyanna Stark would wed Robert Baratheon, binding the north to the Stormlands. Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon had been fostered together at the Eyrie, making them brothers in all but blood. And Jon Arryn himself had no children, no heirs. Some whispered he might name Ned or Robert as his successor when the time came. A web of alliances, careful, deliberate, spanning half the 7 kingdoms. Lord Hoster Tully was a careful man, growing old now, his red hair shot through with grey. He wanted security for his daughters, stability for his lands. The Riverlands sat in the centre of Westeros, surrounded by potential enemies. Strong alliances weren't just useful, they were necessary for survival. Jon Arryn was older still, his face lined with years of carrying responsibility. He'd seen wars before. He'd seen what happened when the realm tore itself apart. He wanted peace. But peace required strength, and strength required unity among the great houses. If the king continued his descent into madness, the realm would need strong lords ready to hold things together. He did not say this aloud. He did not need to. The others understood. Lord Rickard Stark spoke least of all. He was a northerner, unused to the elaborate games of southern politics. But he was not stupid. He saw what was happening. The Mad King grew worse with every moon. His son Rhaegar was loved by the people, but seemed reluctant to act. Someone would need to make hard choices, eventually. The question was who, and when, and at what cost. They did not speak of rebellion. That word was treason. That word meant death. But they spoke of preparation, of ensuring their houses stood together if trouble came, of protecting their children and their lands from whatever storm might be gathering on the horizon. Outside the pavilion, guards stood watch. They saw nothing unusual. 3 lords sharing wine and conversation at a tourney. Perfectly normal, perfectly innocent. But in the shadows between the tents, a small figure moved silently through the darkness. Varys had many eyes and ears throughout the camp. Little birds, he called them. Children, mostly. Orphans and bastards, paid in copper to watch and listen and report what they saw. Some were servants in noble households. Others were beggars in the camps. All of them invisible to the great lords who never looked at small folk faces. The spider's web stretched wide, and it caught many secrets in its threads. In another part of the camp, Robert Baratheon held court among his friends from the Stormlands. Wine flowed freely. Laughter echoed loud enough to carry across the water. Robert sat in the centre of it all, already drunk, telling stories of hunts and battles, his massive hands gesturing wildly. He was happy here, surrounded by men who loved him, who would follow him anywhere, who asked nothing of him except that he be himself. No politics, no scheming, no careful words chosen to avoid given offence, just honest fellowship and strong drink and the promise of violence tomorrow in the melee. One of his companions mentioned Lyanna Stark, Robert's betrothed. Robert grinned and said something crude about what he would do on their wedding night. His friends roared with laughter. They refilled his cup. They toasted to the Wolf Girl and the Storm Lord. None of them noticed the figure standing at the edge of the firelight. Eddard Stark had come looking for his friend, hoping to speak with him privately. But hearing Robert's words, hearing the laughter, Ned turned and walked away without announcing himself. He loved Robert like a brother, but sometimes he wondered if Robert would ever grow up, if he would ever understand that Lyanna was not a prize to be won, but a person with her own thoughts and feelings. Ned had tried to tell him. Robert had laughed and slapped him on the back and said Ned worried too much. Perhaps he did, or perhaps he did not worry enough. In the towers of Harrenhal itself, King Aerys paced his chambers like a caged animal. He had not stopped thinking about the Knight of the Laughing Tree. Who was it? What did they want? Why hide their face unless they had something to hide? His mind spun the mystery into a conspiracy. Someone was mocking him. Someone was challenging his authority. Someone was testing his defenses, preparing for a greater attack. The Mystery Knight was just the beginning, a signal, a message to his enemies that the time was near. Aerys called for Lord Varys. The spider came quickly, as he always did, bowing low, his soft voice murmuring reassurances. The king demanded answers. Who was the Mystery Knight? Had they been found? Had they been questioned? Varys spread his hands apologetically. Not yet, your grace. But my little birds are searching. We will find the truth. These things take time, but truth cannot hide forever. Aerys was not satisfied. He wanted the Mystery Knight found immediately, brought before him, questioned, punished, made an example of what happened to those who mocked their king. Varys bowed again and promised to redouble his efforts. Then he slipped away like smoke, leaving the king to his pacing and his paranoia. Outside the royal chambers, Sir Jaime Lannister stood guard with Sir Jonathan Darry. They could hear the king's voice through the thick oak door, rising and falling, sometimes shouting, sometimes muttering. Neither knight spoke. They had learned not to comment on what they heard while guarding the king's door. But Jaime thought about it. He thought about it constantly. This was the man he had sworn to protect. This raving madman who saw traitors in every shadow. This was what the white cloak meant, standing guard while a king lost his mind, doing nothing, saying nothing, because the oath forbade it. Sir Jonathan was older, weathered, a man who had served in the king's guard for decades. He kept his eyes forward and his face carefully blank. He had learned long ago not to think too much about what he heard. Do your duty. Protect the king. Nothing else matters. Jaime envied him that. The ability to simply stop thinking. To turn off the part of his mind that questioned and judged and wondered if this was really what honour looked like. Across the castle, in quarters given to the Martells, Princess Aelia sat with her ladies and tried not to think about her husband. Rhaegar had barely spoken to her since they arrived at Harrenhal. He was always somewhere else, always distracted, always reading his scrolls and muttering about prophecy and the dragon having 3 heads. She knew he did not love her. That was fine. Love was not required for a political marriage. But she had hoped for respect, for kindness, for the simple courtesy of being acknowledged as his wife and the mother of his children. Instead, she felt like furniture in his life, present but unremarked upon, necessary but not valued. Her ladies tried to distract her with gossip and songs, but Aelia heard the whispers. They pitied her. The Dornish princess married to a prince who barely noticed her existence. It would have been less humiliating if he took mistresses. At least then, she would know what she was competing with. But Rhaegar seemed to want nothing except his prophecies and his melancholy. And that was somehow worse than any infidelity. In his own pavilion, Prince Rhaegar sat alone with his scrolls and books, reading by candlelight. He had read these texts 100 times, 1,000. He knew them by heart. But he kept searching for something he had missed, some clue, some answer to the questions that haunted him, the prince that was promised, the song of ice and fire. The dragon must have 3 heads. He had 2 children. He needed 3. But Aelia could bear no more. The maesters had made that clear. So what was he supposed to do? The prophecy demanded 3. He was certain of it. Everything depended on it. The fate of the world hung on him getting this right. But how? Rhaegar set down his scroll and rubbed his eyes. Sometimes he wondered if he was going mad like his father, obsessing over prophecies and portents, seeing significance in every dream and vision. But no, his father's madness was paranoia and cruelty. Rhaegar's burden was different. He knew what was coming. The long night, the darkness, the threat from beyond the wall that no one else remembered or believed in. He had to be ready. He had to prepare, even if no one understood, even if they thought him strange and distant and cold. The dragon must have 3 heads. somewhere in the camps, the Knight of the Laughing Tree hid from the king's searchers. The mystery knight had shed the borrowed armour, scattered the pieces, ensured they could not be traced back to any one source. The shield with the laughing weirwood had been broken apart and burned. Now the knight was just another face in the crowd, invisible, safe, for now. But the king would keep searching, and Aerys was mad, not stupid. Eventually, someone would talk. Someone always talked. The mystery knight would need to be very careful in the days to come. In a quiet corner of the camp, away from the noise and celebration, Lyanna Stark walked alone. She had escaped her guards, something she had become very good at over the years. They thought she was in her tent with her ladies. They would not check for hours. She walked beside the God's Eye, the great lake stretching out dark and still beneath the stars. The water reflected the moon like a mirror. The air smelled of grass and water and the distant smoke of campfires. Lyanna thought about the tourney, about the knights fighting for glory, about the ladies watching and giggling and tying their favours to lances, about her upcoming marriage to Robert Baratheon, a man she barely knew and was not sure she wanted to know. She thought about the Knight of the Laughing Tree, about standing up for the weak, about taking action when you saw something wrong instead of sitting quietly like a proper lady and doing nothing. She thought about freedom, about choice, about all the things she would lose when she became Robert's wife. The water lapped gently at the shore. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. Or perhaps it was just a dog. Lyanna could not tell from here. She stood there for a long time, alone with her thoughts, before finally turning back toward the camp. Her guards would notice soon, if they had not already. There would be trouble when she returned. There was always trouble when she disappeared. But for this one moment, she had been free, and that was worth whatever scolding awaited her. Back in the camp, in a dozen different pavilions, lords and ladies settled in for the night. Some slept peacefully. Others lay awake, thinking about the day's events, planning for tomorrow. The tourney would continue. More jousts, more contests, and eventually the great melee where the best warriors would face each other in brutal combat. But beneath the surface of sport and celebration, other games were being played. Political games, dangerous games, games where the stakes were higher than anyone wanted to admit. King Aerys lay in his bed and dreamed of traitors burning. Lord Rickard Stark thought about his alliances and wondered if they would be enough when the storm came. Jon Arryn prayed for peace, even as he prepared for war. Robert Baratheon drank himself into unconsciousness, blissfully unaware of the forces gathering around him. And Varys sat in his modest chambers, reviewing reports from his little birds, filing away secrets like a miser counting gold. Information was power, and power was what kept you alive when kingdoms fell and kings went mad. The night deepened. The fires burned low. One by one, the camps grew quiet as people finally surrendered to sleep. But Harrenhal itself never truly slept. The old stones remembered too much. 300 years of history soaked into every brick and beam, the screams of Harren the Black and his sons as dragonfire melted the towers around them. The ghosts of everyone who had died within these cursed walls since. Some said Harrenhal was unlucky, that every house that held it was doomed to fall, that the stones themselves were poisoned by the manner of their making, built with the blood and suffering of thousands of slaves. Perhaps that was true, Or perhaps it was simply that desperate men made desperate choices, and Harrenhal attracted the desperate like moths to flame. Either way, the castle loomed in the darkness, its 5 towers reaching up toward the uncaring stars, and the people sleeping in its shadow had no idea how much those stars would fall before this was over. The second day of the tourney at Harrenhal would dawn soon. More knights would compete, more lances would shatter, more glory would be won and lost. But in the shadows and the silence, in the whispered conversations and the careful plans, the true contest was already underway. A contest not of steel and strength, but of will and ambition, and the terrible weight of choice. And unlike the tourney, this contest would have no winners, only survivors, if anyone survived at all. The second day of the tourney dawned grey and cold. The false spring had faltered overnight, a chill wind blowing in from the north, carrying the promise of winter's return. The crowds gathered anyway, pulling their cloaks tight, determined not to miss a moment of the spectacle. The jousting continued through the morning, the field of competitors narrowing with each pass. The great knights proved their worth. Sir Barristan Selmy remained undefeated, his lance striking true every time. Sir Arthur Dane advanced through his bracket with the same surgical precision he brought to everything. Even old Sir Gerald Hightower, the White Bull, showed he could still compete with men half his age. But the matches everyone was waiting for had not yet come. The brackets had been arranged so that the greatest knights would not face each other until the later rounds. The crowds wanted to see their champions clash at the climax of the tourney, not waste themselves in the early tilts. So the draws had been made carefully, though everyone pretended it was random chance. Politics and sport were never far apart, even in the lists. By afternoon, the field had narrowed to the final rounds. Only the truly skilled remained. Knights whose names were known across the 7 kingdoms. Men who had proven themselves in war and peace, in tourneys and battles, against the best opponents the realm could offer. The crowd pressed close to the barriers, shouting encouragement, making final wagers. Wine sellers moved through the stands, their voices hoarse from calling out their wares. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders to see over the masses. Even King Aerys seemed more engaged, leaning forward in his seat, his fevered eyes tracking every movement. The semi-final matches began. Sir Barristan Selmy faced a knight from the Reach, a big man known for his powerful charges. They met 3 times in the lists. The first pass shattered both lances, but neither man fell. The second pass saw the Reachman's shield split down the middle. The third pass ended with the Reachman in the dust and Sir Barristan raising his broken lance to the roaring crowd. Barristan the Bold. The crowd chanted his name. He had served in the King's Guard for years, had fought in the War of the Ninepenny Kings, had saved King Aerys himself during the defiance of Duskendale. He was a living legend, and he fought like one. The other semi-final match was Prince Rhaegar against Sir Arthur Dane. The crowd fell silent when they took their positions. This was what they had come to see, the prince against the Sword of the Morning. 2 of the finest knights in the realm, perhaps in a generation. The outcome could go either way. King Aerys watched with narrowed eyes. He wanted his son to lose. The thought was ugly, but undeniable. He wanted Rhaegar humbled before the realm, wanted the crowds to see that the prince was not invincible, was not the perfect golden heir they imagined. But Aerys also wanted his house to win. Targaryen pride ran deep, even through madness. So the king sat in conflict with himself, unable to decide which outcome he preferred. The marshal raised his flag. The crowd held its breath. The flag dropped. Both horses exploded forward in a thunder of hooves. Rhaegar and Arthur charged at each other like comets colliding, their lances held steady, their aim perfect. They had trained together for years. They knew each other's style, each other's tricks. This would not be decided by surprise, but by pure skill. They met in the centre with a crash that echoed across the water. Both lances shattered. Both knights rocked in their saddles. But both held their seats. The crowd erupted in cheers and groans, depending on who they had wagered on. The knights returned to their ends and took fresh lances. This would take multiple passes, perhaps many. They charged again and again and again, 6 passes, 7, 8. The lances shattered like kindling. The horses began to tire. Both knights adjusted their aim, searching for the perfect angle, the exact point of weakness that would end this. On the 9th pass, Rhaegar struck Arthur's shield at precisely the right angle, the force travelling up through the sword of the morning's arm and into his shoulder. It was not enough to unhorse him, but it was enough to throw off his balance for a fraction of a second. And a fraction of a second was all Rhaegar needed. The 10th pass ended with Sir Arthur Dayne on the ground, his white cloak spread beneath him like snow, his armour dented, but intact. He rose slowly, picked up his helm, and walked to where Rhaegar sat on his stallion. The prince dismounted and embraced his friend. They spoke words the crowd could not hear. Then Arthur raised Rhaegar's hand in victory. The crowd's roar could have been heard in King's Landing. King Aerys sat back in his seat, his expression unreadable. Beside him, Queen Rhaella allowed herself a small smile. Her son had won. Whatever else happened, she could be proud of that. In the stands, lords and ladies applauded, some genuinely, some because it was politic to cheer for the prince. Brandon Stark whistled his approval. Eddard Stark clapped politely. Robert Baratheon drank from his cup and said something about how he would have done better in the melee. And Lyanna Stark watched Prince Rhaegar with eyes that saw more than a tournament champion. She saw the sadness in him, even in victory. The weight he carried that no one else could see. She wondered what it must be like to be him, to have everything the world could offer and still seem so alone. The final match was set. Sir Barristan Selmy against Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, the greatest living knight against the Prince of the Realm, old skill against young strength. It would be a match worthy of songs. But first, the melee. The jousting was noble and precise. The melee was chaos and brutality. Dozens of knights entered the field at once, divided into 2 teams, armed with blunted swords and blunted axes and blunted maces. They would fight until only one team remained standing. No rules except that you couldn't kill your opponent. Injuries were expected. Broken bones, concussions, missing teeth. The maesters prepared their supplies and waited beside the field. Robert Baratheon had been waiting for this all day. He entered the lists in his black and gold armour, his warhammer in his hands, a grin splitting his bearded face. This was his kind of fighting. No prancing around with lances, just honest violence between men who wanted to hurt each other. Brandon Stark fought in the melee as well, despite his father's concerns. He wore northern armour of grey steel and carried a longsword that he wielded with frightening speed. The wolf in the melee. He intended to make sure no one forgot it. The teams formed up on opposite sides of the field. The marshal raised his flag. The crowd pressed forward, eager to see blood. The flag fell. Chaos erupted. The two sides crashed together like waves meeting in a storm. Steel rang on steel. Men shouted and cursed. Bodies slammed together. The blunted weapons might not cut, but they could still break ribs and shatter arms and cave in helmets. Robert Baratheon waded into the fight, like a man possessed. His hammer rose and fell with terrible rhythm. Every swing sent a knight stumbling backward or crashing to the ground. He laughed as he fought, a booming sound that cut through the noise of battle. This was what he lived for. Brandon Stark fought with cold precision, his sword a blur, targeting joints and weak points in armor. He was not as strong as Robert, but who was faster, more controlled. He fought like a northerner, efficiently, without wasted movement, aiming to disable rather than impress. The melee lasted for nearly an hour. Knights fell, one by one, dragged from the field by squires and maesters. The teams shrank. The fighting became more desperate. Those still standing were covered in mud and dents, their breath coming in ragged gasps. In the end, it came down to 3 men. Robert Baratheon, Brandon Stark, and a knight from the Westerlands, whose name would be forgotten by tomorrow. The Westerlander went down first, Robert's hammer catching him in the chest and folding him like a puppet with cut strings. That left Robert and Brandon. They circled each other, both breathing hard, both grinning despite their exhaustion. They had trained together at the Eyrie. They knew each other's styles. This would be a true test. Robert attacked first, his hammer swinging in wide, powerful arcs. Brandon gave ground, deflecting rather than blocking, waiting for an opening. They traded blows for long minutes, neither gaining a clear advantage. Then Brandon saw his chance. Robert overcommitted to a swing, his momentum carrying him forward. Brandon stepped inside his guard and swept his legs. The Stormlord went down hard, the impact driving the breath from his lungs. Brandon's sword was at his throat, a heartbeat later. The crowd went wild. The Wolf of Winterfell had defeated the Stormlord. It would be talked about for months. Robert lay in the mud for a moment, then started laughing. He reached up, grabbed Brandon's hand, and let himself be pulled to his feet. He embraced the Stark like a brother, pounding his back hard enough to bruise. A good fight. An honest fight. No politics. No schemes. Just 2 warriors testing themselves against each other. Robert loved Brandon for that. They would drink together tonight and laugh about it. But the main event was still to come. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the final joust was prepared. Sir Barristan Selmy against Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. The crowds packed in even tighter, not wanting to miss a moment. King Aerys leaned forward in his seat, his hands gripping the armrests. Queen Rhaella watched with a mother's worry. Princess Elia sat with her children, her face carefully composed. And throughout the stands, lords and ladies and small folk all waited to see who would be crowned champion of the greatest tourney in living memory. The 2 knights took their positions, Sir Barristan on his grey destrier, his white cloak streaming behind him, Prince Rhaegar on his black stallion, the rubies in his armour catching the failing light. The marshal raised his flag, the crowd held its breath, the flag fell, they charged, The first pass shattered both lances, but neither man fell. The crowd roared. The second pass was the same. They were too evenly matched, too skilled. This would take time. They charged again, and again. The sun sank lower. The shadows grew longer. Still they fought, neither willing to yield, neither able to gain the decisive advantage. On the seventh pass, Rhaegar's lance struck Sir Barristan's shield at an angle that sent splinters flying like shrapnel. The older knight swayed, but held his seat. Barely. The eighth pass ended it. Rhaegar's aim was perfect, his timing flawless. His lance caught Sir Barristan square in the chest, and the finest knight in the Seven Kingdoms toppled backward out of his saddle and crashed to the earth. The crowd erupted, some in joy, some in dismay, all in awe. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen had won, champion of the tourney at Harrenhal. Rhaegar dismounted and went to help Sir Barristan to his feet. The older knight clasped his hand and spoke words of congratulation. There was no shame in losing to such an opponent, not in a match that close. The herald's voice boomed across the field, announcing the victor. Lord Went came forward with a crown of winter roses, blue as frost, woven together with silk. The champion's crown, to be given to the Queen of Love and Beauty, the lady the champion honoured above all others. This was tradition. This was expected. Prince Rhaegar would place the crown on his wife's lap. Princess Elia would smile graciously. The crowd would cheer. And the tourney would end on a note of romance and chivalry, exactly as such things were supposed to end. But Prince Rhaegar took the crown of winter roses in his hands and did not ride toward his wife. Instead, he turned his horse and rode slowly along the stands. The crowd grew quiet, confused. Where was he going? What was he doing? Princess Elia sat very still, her face frozen. She knew. Somehow, she already knew Rhaegar stopped his horse in front of a section of the stands where the Northern Lords sat. His eyes, dark and sad and certain, locked on a single face. Lyanna Stark. The world seemed to stop. Prince Rhaegar raised the crown of winter roses, and, with every eye in Harrenhal watching, laid it gently in Lyanna Stark's lap. The silence lasted for 3 heartbeats, 4, 5, then the whispers began. Quiet at first, then louder, spreading through the crowd like fire through dry grass. Shock, confusion, scandal. Lyanna sat frozen, the crown of blue roses in her lap, her grey eyes wide. She did not know what to do, did not know what to say. Around her people stared, pointed, whispered. Brandon Stark's face had gone dark with fury. His hand moved to where his sword would be, but he wore no weapon here. Lord Rickard's expression was unreadable, but his jaw was clenched tight enough to crack stone. Robert Baratheon stood in the stands, his face flushing red, his hands curling into fists. That was his betrothed, his future wife. And the prince had just crowned her before all the 7 kingdoms. The insult could not be more public, or more deliberate. Princess Elia rose and walked from the stands without a word, her ladies following behind her. No one tried to stop her. What could anyone say? King Aerys began to laugh, a high cackling sound that made everyone nearby flinch. His son had done it now, created a scandal, embarrassed powerful lords, made enemies. The king's laughter echoed across the field, edged with madness, and something that might have been delight. Prince Rhaegar sat on his black horse, the crown of winter roses, now resting in Lyanna Stark's lap, and for just a moment his sad eyes met hers. Then he turned his horse and rode from the field, leaving chaos in his wake. The tourney at Harrenhal was over. The champion had been crowned. The Queen of Love and Beauty had been chosen. And nothing would ever be the same. The feast that night was a hollow thing. Lord Went had prepared a grand celebration to mark the end of the tourney. The great hall of Harrenhal was filled with tables, laden with food and wine. Musicians played in the galleries. Servants moved through the crowds, carrying platters of roasted meats and fresh bread. Candles burned in iron sconces, casting dancing shadows on walls that had stood for 300 years. But the joy had drained from the gathering like water through a cracked cup. People ate because it was expected. They drank because the wine was there. They spoke in low voices, carefully, watching who might be listening. The scandal hung over everything like a storm cloud, heavy and dark, and ready to break. Prince Rhaegar attended the feast. He sat at the high table, his expression distant, as if his mind was somewhere else entirely. He barely touched his food. He did not speak unless spoken to. And when he did speak, his words were polite but empty, the kind of pleasantries that meant nothing and revealed less. Princess Aelia did not attend. She remained in her chambers with her children and her ladies. No one expected her to come. No one would have blamed her if she had left Harrenhal entirely and returned to Dorne. The humiliation she had suffered was complete and public. Every person at the tourney had witnessed it. Her husband crowning another woman, a woman he barely knew, a woman promised to another man. The Dornish delegation sat together at their tables, their faces hard, their voices sharp when they spoke. Princess Aelia was theirs, one of them, and she had been dishonored before all the 7 kingdoms. This was not something they would forget. Or forgive. King Aerys sat in his place of honor, picking at his food with his long yellow nails, occasionally breaking into fits of laughter at nothing anyone else could see. He seemed pleased by the chaos his son had created, as if watching the realm squirm gave him some twisted satisfaction. The Kingsguard stood behind the high table, white cloaks hanging still as stone. Sir Jaime Lannister watched the feast with eyes that missed nothing. He saw the Dornishman's anger. He saw Robert Baratheon drinking himself into a rage. He saw Lord Rickard Stark's carefully controlled fury. He saw all of it and understood that something had broken here tonight. Something that couldn't be easily repaired, if it could be repaired at all. The Stark table was a study in tension. Lord Rickard sat like a statue carved from ice, his face revealing nothing. But his sons knew him well enough to read the signs, the tightness around his eyes, the way his hands gripped his cup. Their father was furious. Brandon Stark was not so controlled. He drank heavily, his face flushed, his words growing louder as the night wore on. He wanted to confront Rhaegar, to demand an explanation, to defend his sister's honor and his own. His friends from the north had to physically restrain him twice from storming the high table. Eddard Stark sat beside his brother, quieter but no less troubled. He watched Lyanna across the hall. She sat with the northern ladies, the crown of winter roses nowhere to be seen. Someone had taken it away, hidden it, as if that could make what happened disappear. Lyanna's face was pale, but composed. She spoke little. She did not look toward the high table where Prince Rhaegar sat. She kept her eyes down, her hands folded in her lap, playing the part of the proper lady she had never wanted to be. But Ned knew his sister. He saw the way her jaw was set, the way she held herself too still, like someone trying not to flinch. She was not as calm as she appeared. She was simply better at hiding it than Brandon. Robert Baratheon sat with his Stormlanders, and with each cup of wine his mood grew darker. His betrothed, his future wife, crowned by another man, by a prince no less. As if Robert was not good enough. As if Lyanna Stark was something Robert had no right to claim. The insult burned in his chest like dragonfire. He had never been refused anything in his life. Women threw themselves at him. Men followed him. He was young and strong and rich and powerful. He should have been the champion of the Tourney. He should have been the one crowning his lady. Instead, he had lost the melee to Brandon Stark and watched from the stands while Rhaegar Targaryen made a mockery of his betrothal. Robert's friends tried to soothe him, tried to make light of it. Just a tourney gesture, they said. Just a prince being strange. It meant nothing. But Robert knew it meant something. The whole realm knew it meant something. You did not crown another man's betrothed unless you were making a statement, and Rhaegar had made his statement before thousands of witnesses. Jon Arryn sat at a table with the other Vale lords, his old face troubled. He had built his alliances carefully. Stark and Baratheon and Tully, all bound together through fosterage and marriage. A network of friendships and obligations that would hold the realm together if the Mad King finally went too far. But now Rhaegar had thrown a torch into the middle of it all. Robert's pride was wounded. The Starks were insulted. The carefully constructed bonds were straining under the weight of scandal and anger. Jon Arryn had lived a long time. He had seen many things. He knew how quickly situations could spiral out of control when young men's honor was at stake. He needed to smooth this over, to calm tempers, to remind everyone that a gesture at a tourney, however inappropriate, was not worth destroying alliances over. But looking at Robert's face, at Brandon's barely controlled rage, at the Dornishman's cold fury, Jon Arryn wondered if this could be smoothed over. Some insults cut too deep. Some wounds refused to heal. Across the hall, Lord Varys moved between tables like a ghost, his soft voice murmuring pleasantries, his ears catching every whispered conversation. The Spider had much to think about tonight. This scandal would ripple outward for months, years perhaps. Alliances would shift. Grudges would form. And in the chaos, opportunities would arise for those clever enough to see them. Varys served the realm. That was what he always said. But the realm was an abstract thing, and Varys was a practical man. He served stability. He served peace. He served whatever arrangement would keep the Seven Kingdoms from tearing themselves apart in civil war. And tonight, watching the feast descend into barely suppressed fury, Varys wondered if peace was still possible, or if Prince Rhaegar had just planted the seeds of war without even realizing it. The feast dragged on into the night. People left in ones and twos, making excuses, retreating to their pavilions and chambers. The music continued, but no one danced. The wine flowed, but brought no joy. Even the servants seemed subdued, as if they could feel the weight of what had happened pressing down on everyone. Prince Rhaegar left early, escorted by his guards, disappearing into the dark corridors of Harrenhal without a word to anyone. King Aerys followed soon after, still laughing to himself, his Kingsguard surrounding him in white. Robert Baratheon drank until he could barely stand, then was half carried back to his pavilion by his friends. He shouted curses at the night sky, at Prince Rhaegar, at the world that had insulted him. His friends tried to quiet him, tried to get him inside before he said something that could not be unsaid. But Robert was beyond caring. He had been humiliated, and Robert Baratheon did not forgive humiliation. Brandon Stark left the feast with murder in his eyes. Lord Rickard called after him, but Brandon did not stop. He stalked through Harrenhal's halls, his friends following, trying to talk sense into him. They managed to prevent him from confronting Rhaegar that night, but it was a near thing. The hot wolf, they called Brandon. And tonight he lived up to the name. Lyanna Stark slipped away from the feast as early as she could without causing more scandal. She returned to her chambers where her ladies waited, their faces full of questions they did not dare ask. Lyanna said nothing. She dismissed them and sat alone in the darkness, staring at nothing. The crown of winter roses had been hidden away. But Lyanna could still feel their weight in her lap, could still see Prince Rhaegar's sad eyes looking at her, could still hear the shocked silence that fell over the crowd. She did not know what to think, did not know what to feel. Part of her was angry at the prince for making her the centre of such a scandal. Part of her was confused by the gesture, uncertain what it meant. And part of her, a part she would not admit even to herself, was moved by it. Someone had seen her, had chosen her, not because she was promised to someone powerful, not because her father commanded it, but because Prince Rhaegar, for reasons she could not understand, had wanted to honour her above all others. It was foolish to feel anything but anger. She knew that. This gesture had potentially ruined her betrothal, embarrassed her family, and made her the subject of scandal and gossip that would follow her for years. But in the darkness of her chamber, alone with her thoughts, Lyanna Stark allowed herself to feel something other than anger. Just for a moment. Just until morning came, and she would have to face the consequences of what Prince Rhaegar had done. In the Dornish quarters, Princess Aelia sat with her brother's letter in her hands. Prince Oberyn had not attended the tourney. He was in Essos, she thought, or perhaps already on his way back to Sunspear. But Prince Doran was here, her oldest brother, the one who would one day rule Dorne. He'd come to her chambers after the feast to check on her, to offer what comfort he could. But there was no comfort to be had, only cold political reality. Aelia was the princess, the mother of Rhaegar's children. That position could not be taken from her by a crown of flowers at a tourney. Her marriage was secure, at least in law. But law was not the same as respect. Law was not the same as love, or loyalty, or any of the things a wife might hope for from a husband. Rhaegar had humiliated her publicly, had shown the realm that he valued some northern girl more than his own wife. Whether he intended that message or not, it was the message everyone received. Prince Doran spoke carefully, his words measured. He was a cautious man, a careful man, a man who thought in years rather than moments. He would not act rashly, would not demand immediate satisfaction, but neither would he forget. Dorne remembered. Dorne always remembered. For now, they would endure. They would be patient. They would watch and wait and see how this played out. But if more insults came, if Aelia was further humiliated, then there would be consequences. Dorne did not forgive easily, and the Martells repaid their debts in full. The night deepened. Harrenhal fell quiet. In pavilions and chambers throughout the castle and camps, people lay awake thinking about what had happened, trying to understand it, trying to decide how to respond. Some saw it as a scandal, but nothing more. A prince being foolish. A gesture that would be forgotten in a few months once newer scandals emerged. They were wrong, but they did not know it yet. Others saw it as an insult that demanded response, a challenge that could not go unanswered. They were closer to the truth, but they still did not understand the full weight of what had been set in motion. And a few, the wisest and most cynical, saw it as the beginning of something larger. The first crack in the foundation. The moment when the realm began its slow collapse toward chaos and war. They were right, but knowing it would not help them. Because some things, once begun, cannot be stopped. They can only be endured until they burn themselves out. Lord Rickard Stark sat in his pavilion with Jon Arryn, the two old friends speaking in voices too low for guards to hear. The marriage between Lyanna and Robert was in jeopardy now. Robert's pride would not easily accept what had happened, and if that marriage fell apart, the entire network of alliances would weaken. They had worked so carefully to build these bonds. Stark and Baratheon and Arryn and Tully. A coalition that could stand against anyone, even the Mad King if it came to that. But now, Prince Rhaegar's careless gesture threatened to shatter it all. Unless they could repair the damage, unless they could convince Robert to let it go, to see past the insult, to remember what was important. Jon Arryn thought it could be done. Robert was proud, but he loved Ned like a brother. And Ned could make Robert see reason if anyone could. Lord Rickard was not so certain. He had seen the look in Robert's eyes, wounded pride and growing rage. Men like Robert did not forgive easily, and men like Robert, when wounded, lashed out at whatever was closest. They talked long into the night, making plans, considering options, trying to save what could be saved from the wreckage of the day. But neither of them knew that it was already too late, that the damage couldn't be undone, that Prince Rhaegar's gesture, whatever he intended by it, had set in motion a chain of events that would end with the realm bleeding and kingdoms burning. The tourney at Harrenhal had ended. The champion had been crowned. The Queen of Love and Beauty had been chosen. And in choosing her, Prince Rhaegar Targaryen had doomed them all. But that understanding would come later. For now, there was only confusion and anger and hurt pride, only the immediate shock of scandal and the desperate attempts to make sense of it. Morning would come soon, and with it, decisions that couldn't be unmade, words that couldn't be taken back, choices that would echo through the years like thunder rolling across mountains. The year of the full spring was ending, the real winter was coming, and no one was ready for it. The morning after, the crown of winter roses broke grey and cold over Harrenhal. The false spring was dying. Everyone could feel it in the air, in the wind that cut through cloaks and bit at exposed skin. The grass that had grown green and lush was already beginning to wither. The flowers that had bloomed weeks early were turning brown at the edges. Winter was reasserting itself. The brief warmth had been an illusion, a false promise. And now the price would be paid. The camps began to break up at dawn. Lords and knights packed their pavilions and loaded their wagons. The small folk who had come to watch the tourney started the long walk back to their villages and farms. The merchants counted their profits and losses and prepared to move on to the next gathering, the next opportunity. The great tourney at Harrenhal was over, and everyone who had attended it carried away something different. Memories of jousts and melees, stories they would tell their children, grievances they would nurse for years, alliances strengthened or broken, insults given and received. But most of all, they carried away questions. What had Prince Rhaegar meant by crowning Lyanna Stark? What would come of the scandal? How would the great houses respond? What did it mean for the realm? No one had answers. Not yet. But the questions would haunt them all. King Aerys departed Harrenhal in the early morning, surrounded by his guards and his Kingsguard, eager to return to the Red Keep, where he felt safe behind thick walls and locked doors. He had enjoyed the tourney in his way, had enjoyed watching his enemies squirm, watching his son create chaos, watching the realm, reminded that House Targaryen still held the Iron Throne. But now he wanted to go home, back to King's Landing, back to his chambers where he could watch for assassins and plot against traitors and slowly descend further into the madness that consumed him more each day. Sir Jaime Lannister rode beside the royal wheelhouse, his white cloak snapping in the cold wind. He was returning to King's Landing as well, back to standing guard, back to watching his king go mad, back to the cage the white cloak had become. He thought about the tourney as they rode, about the knights he had watched compete, about Prince Rhaegar's victory and the scandal that followed, about the look on Princess Elia's face when her husband crowned another woman. Jaime understood honour in theory. The Kingsguard was supposed to embody it. But the more he saw of the world, the more he wondered if honour was just a word people used to justify whatever they wanted to do. Prince Rhaegar thought he was being honourable, perhaps, following some prophecy, some higher purpose. But he had hurt his wife and insulted powerful lords and created problems that might take years to resolve. Was that honour? Or was it just selfishness dressed in pretty words? Jaime did not know. He was 17, and already tired of questions he could not answer. Prince Rhaegar left Harrenhal separately, riding with his own guards, taking a different route back toward King's Landing. He did not speak of what he had done, did not explain or justify or apologize. He simply rode in silence, his mind clearly elsewhere, his eyes distant. Some of his companions tried to ask him about the crown of winter roses, about why he had chosen Lyanna Stark, about what he was thinking. But Rhaegar gave them nothing. Just vague words about prophecy and necessity and things they would not understand. They stopped trying after a while. You couldn't force Rhaegar Targaryen to explain himself. He would speak when he was ready, if he ever was, and not before. Princess Elia left for Dragonstone with her children and her ladies. She did not say goodbye to her husband, did not send him any message. She simply gathered her household and departed, her face carefully composed, her dignity intact, despite everything. The Dornish lords rode with her part of the way before breaking off toward the south. They spoke little, but their anger was clear in every rigid line of their bodies, every harsh word they muttered when they thought no one was listening. Prince Doran rode at the head of the Dornish column, his face thoughtful. He was a patient man, a careful man. He would not act hastily, but he would remember this. Dorne always remembered. The Stark party prepared to depart for the long journey north. Lord Rickard supervised the packing with his usual efficiency, ensuring everything was secured, everyone accounted for. He spoke to his children in private before they left, though no one knew what was said. Brandon Stark looked like a man ready for war. His jaw was set, his hands never far from his sword, his eyes burning with barely suppressed rage. The insult to his sister, to his family, to his own honour as her brother. It was too much to simply swallow and forget. His friends watched him carefully. They had seen Brandon angry before, but this was different. This was deeper, more dangerous. They worried about what he might do when they returned to Winterfell, and he had time to brood on the insult. Eddard Stark rode beside his sister for much of the journey. He did not ask her questions about what happened, did not demand explanations. He simply stayed close, a quiet presence, letting her know she was not alone. Lyanna appreciated it more than she could say. Everyone else looked at her with questions in their eyes, or pity, or judgment. But Ned just looked at her like she was his sister, and he loved her. Nothing more complicated than that. She did not speak of Prince Rhaegar, did not mention the crown of winter roses. That part of her life was locked away, buried deep, where no one could see it. She was betrothed to Robert Baratheon. That had not changed, despite the scandal. Her father had confirmed it. The marriage would proceed. She would do her duty. She always had, even when it hurt. Robert Baratheon left Harrenhal in a black mood that would not lift for months. He rode hard, pushing his companions to keep pace, as if he could outrun his humiliation through sheer speed and determination. He did not speak of Lyanna Stark, did not mention Prince Rhaegar, but everyone around him could feel his anger like heat from a forge. This was not something Robert would forget, or forgive. Not easily, perhaps not ever. Jon Arryn rode with him, trying to counsel patience, trying to remind Robert of the bigger picture. The alliances they had built, the importance of the marriage, the need to think politically rather than emotionally. Robert listened with half an ear and ignored most of it. He was not a political creature. He was a warrior, and warriors responded to insults with steel, not patience. The great houses scattered like seeds on the wind, each returning to their own domains, carrying with them their own interpretations of what had happened at Harrenhal. Some thought it a scandal that would blow over. Others saw it as an insult that demanded response. Still others recognized it as a symptom of deeper problems in the realm. But all of them agreed on one thing. Something had changed at Harrenhal. Some invisible line had been crossed. The world they returned to was not quite the same as the world they had left. The small folk who had attended the tourney returned to their lives with stories to tell. About the jousts and the melee, about the night of the laughing tree, about Prince Rhaegar crowning the wrong woman. The stories would spread through taverns and markets, growing and changing in the telling, until truth and rumour became impossible to separate. That was how legends were born, in the gap between what happened and what people said happened. Lord Varys remained at Harrenhal for a few days after everyone else had left. He moved through the empty halls and abandoned camps, his little birds reporting what they had seen and heard. Every conversation, every whispered plot, every angry word spoken in wine. The spider collected it all and filed it away, adding to his vast store of secrets. Information was power. And Varys had more information about what happened at Harrenhal than anyone else in the Seven Kingdoms. He knew about the late-night meetings between Lord Rickard Stark and Jon Arryn. He knew about the Dornishmen's fury. He knew about Robert Baratheon's rage and Brandon Stark's barely controlled violence. He knew about Princess Elia's humiliation and Prince Rhaegar's strange detachment from the consequences of his actions. He knew all of it, and he wondered what to do with that knowledge, how to use it, how to serve the realm while serving himself. Because Varys understood something that most of the lords did not. The realm was fragile, held together by tradition and fear and the assumption that tomorrow would be much like yesterday. But when those assumptions broke down, when fear turned to anger and tradition failed to provide answers, the realm could tear itself apart with frightening speed. And Prince Rhaegar had just given everyone a reason to question their assumptions. Harrenhal stood empty once the last travellers had gone. The great castle loomed beside the God's Eye, its 5 towers reaching up toward the grey sky, its walls scarred by dragonfire that had burned 300 years ago, but left marks that would last forever. The servants cleaned the halls and the Tourney grounds. They swept away the broken lances and the scattered flowers. They took down the pavilions and filled in the ruts left by horses and wagons. Within a week, it was as if the great gathering had never happened. But it had happened, and the consequences would ripple outward for years. Later, when men looked back on the events that led to Robert's rebellion, they would point to different moments as the true beginning. Some said it started when Prince Rhaegar allegedly abducted Lyanna Stark. Others said it began when Brandon Stark rode to King's Landing, demanding the prince come out and die. Still others pointed to the moment when King Aerys executed Lord Rickard Stark and his heir, then demanded that Jon Arryn send him the heads of his wards. But the wise ones, the ones who understood how kingdoms fell, they pointed to Harrenhal, to the tourney in the year of the false spring, to the moment when Prince Rhaegar Targaryen placed a crown of winter roses in Lyanna Stark's lap before all the 7 kingdoms. That was where it truly began. That was the moment when the realm started its slide toward war. Because from that moment, everything changed. Robert Baratheon's pride was wounded, and he would never quite trust the Targaryens again. Brandon Stark's honour was insulted, and his protective fury toward his sister would drive him to actions he could not take back. The Dornish felt humiliated, and would remember when the time came to choose sides. Lord Rickard's carefully built alliances were strained to their breaking point, and Lyanna Stark, the girl who never asked for any of this, became the centre of a storm that would eventually consume thousands of lives. She did not know it yet. None of them did. They thought they were returning to their normal lives. They thought the scandal would fade with time. They thought things would go back to how they were before. They were wrong. Within a year, the realm would be at war. Great houses would declare for one side or another. Battles would be fought. Cities would burn. Tens of thousands would die. And at the end of it all, a new king would sit on the Iron Throne, and House Targaryen's 300-year reign would be over. But that was still to come. For now, in the cold weeks after the tourney, there was just confusion, and anger, and hurt feelings. Just the normal business of lords returning to their domains and trying to manage their affairs. The false spring died completely in the weeks that followed. The cold came back harder than before, as if winter was punishing the world for daring to hope for warmth. Snow fell in the north. Frost killed the early crops in the riverlands. People huddled in their homes and wondered if this year's harvest would be enough to see them through. And in castles and holdfasts across the 7 kingdoms, lords and ladies thought about what they had seen at Harrenhal, about the mad king's laughter and the prince's strange gesture, about the alliances that seemed strong but might shatter under pressure, about what they would do if the realm fell into chaos. Some prepared for war, though they would not have called it that. They just wanted to be ready, just in case, just to be safe. Others tried to pretend nothing had changed, tried to go about their business as if the tourney had been nothing more than entertainment, as if Prince Rhaegar's choice meant nothing. But they could not quite convince themselves, because deep down they all felt it. That sense that something fundamental had shifted, that the world was different now in ways they did not fully understand yet. History would remember the tourney at Harrenhal as the last great gathering before the realm tore itself apart, the last moment when all the great houses came together in peace. The last time you could look across a field and see the banners of Stark and Baratheon and Targaryen and Martell all flying side by side without them being divided into armies ready to kill each other. It was the end of an era, though no one knew it at the time. Prince Rhaegar returned to King's Landing and continued his studies of ancient prophecies. He believed he was preparing to save the world from an ancient threat. He believed his actions were necessary. He believed he understood something no one else did. He was right about the threat. The long night would eventually come again, and the realm would need heroes to stand against it. But Rhaegar was wrong about almost everything else. And his belief that he understood prophecy better than anyone else would lead him to make choices that destroyed his family, ended his dynasty, and plunged the 7 kingdoms into a war that killed hundreds of thousands. All because of a crown of winter roses. All because of one moment at a tourney. All because a sad prince thought he knew better than everyone else what the world needed. That was the lesson of Harrenhal, though few learned it. That great disasters rarely announce themselves with thunder and fire. They begin quietly, with a gesture, a choice, a moment that seems small at the time, but carries within it the seeds of everything that follows. The tourney at Harrenhal should have been a celebration, a moment of joy and sport and fellowship, the greatest gathering in living memory, something people would talk about for decades with fondness and pride. Instead, it became a warning, a cautionary tale, the beginning of the end. And if you had been there, standing in those fields beside the God's Eye, watching Prince Rhaegar crown Lyanna Stark with winter roses, you might have felt it too. That cold shiver down your spine, that sense that something terrible had just been set in motion and no one could stop it now. The realm would burn, houses would fall, the world would be remade in blood and fire. But first, there was just a tourney, and a prince who thought he understood prophecy, and a girl who received a crown she never asked for. Sometimes that is all it takes. One moment, one choice, one gesture that changes everything. The last great gathering at Harrenhal ended not with triumph, but with unease. Not with celebration, but with the slow, creeping certainty that nothing would ever be quite the same again. The lords went home. The banners came down. The tourney grounds fell silent. And the 7 kingdoms began their long, terrible slide toward war. If you found this journey through one of the most pivotal moments in Westerosi history compelling, I invite you to share your own thoughts and theories in the comments below. What do you think Prince Rhaegar was truly thinking when he crowned Lyanna Stark? Do you believe he was following prophecy, or was it something more personal? Could the realm have avoided what came next if different choices had been made that day? The story of Harrenhal reminds us that in the world of ice and fire, the smallest actions can have the largest consequences. One crown of winter roses, one moment of choice, and everything changes forever. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the events at Harrenhal, please consider subscribing for more explorations of the hidden corners and pivotal moments in the history of Westeros. There are many more stories to tell, many more moments that shaped the world we know, and I would be honored to have you along for those journeys as well. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about these stories and these characters. And may you never receive a crown you did not ask for. Winter is coming. It always is.